So welcome everybody to today's event on data-enabled agricultural resilience. I'm Barney McCabe. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Application and Data-Enabled Insight, and it's here as ICDI. Well, I'm easier saying that one. This is an institute that was established about a year ago in the Office of Research, Innovation, and Impact to enable the University of Arizona faculty, staff, and students across all disciplines to unlock research solutions and accelerate breakthrough discoveries using the power of information technologies. I'd like to thank our participants from the College of Agricultural Life Sciences and the Arizona Institute for Resilience. Sharon Owen will be here later on that institute. We have partnered with strategic initiatives to create this event, to bring this to you today. The strategic initiatives are intended to develop innovative, adaptive learners and problem solvers across the University of Arizona campus. As an institute, ICDI serves as a hub for incorporating and connecting data-oriented projects and ideas across campuses, across the entire campus. Faculty and students are active in data computation in every quarter of our students, and the exciting things was getting to see how much is going on. We're excited to have this highlighted as part of the strategic plan, which also has a focus on cross-campus collaboration and relationship building. In the talks today, you'll hear about research, training, and education opportunities. ICDI supports the grand challenges and the pillars, in particular in the research focus, but we also support the Wildcat Journey, Arizona Advantage, and Arizona Global. ICDI and its work also spans categories of colleges, and we will be presenting these partnerships and collaboration in the future events. As a land-grant university with cooperative extension services in all 15 Arizona counties, it is appropriate that this be the first in a series of events around data-enabled activities on campus. The strategic plan and action events provide an opportunity for campus community to engage directly with an innovation team to explore progress, partnerships, and impact, local, regional, and international. Thanks for joining us today to learn from an esteemed panel of experts about how digital methods that are increasingly impacting every aspect of human endeavor may offer the best hope for agricultural resilience in the face of disruptive environmental and economic change. The presentations will address benefits and challenges associated with incorporating data-enabled methods to support agricultural resilience in the face of environmental change. We are broadly interested in sustaining diversity of all forms of crops and farming and ranching methods that incorporate regional cultural backgrounds of the people sustaining these businesses, with a stress on resilience and the facing changing conditions that a foundation in data science, computation, and technology applications. You notice on the desks out front there are QR codes. If you scan those, you can get bios from the speakers, and they'll take you to a web page for this event. Before moving on to our program, I'd like to introduce the special guest we have today, a U of A alum, Denise Ross, who has joined us today from Washington, D.C. Denise is the second person and first woman to serve as Chief Data Scientist with the United States. Through this role in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, Denise leads the Biden-Harris administration in equitable data work in equitable data. She also served in the Obama-Biden administration, where she co-founded the White House Policy Police Data Initiative to increase transparency and accountability. Before moving to Washington, Denise served as the City of New Orleans' first open data initiative and co-directed a non-profit data intermediary that became the go-to resource for data to inform equitable recovery after Hurricane Katrina. If you want some interesting stories to figure out how to get that data and what's actually happening on the ground, it's worth talking to Denise about how that data works. Denise holds a Bachelor of Science in Biology from the University of Arizona, class of '94, and a master's degree in energy policy and climate from Johns Hopkins. While at the University of Arizona, Denise was active in undergraduate biology research programs, so part of the undergraduate experiences in research. Denise, would you like to say a few words?
Sure, thank you. Thanks, Barty. It's so good to be here. So thank you so much for having me today. And I wanted to just start out by talking about what the Office of Science and Technology Policy does. We work to harness the power of science, technology, and innovation to achieve America's greatest aspirations and tackle our biggest challenges. So this ag resilience discussion is right up our alley. And it's fantastic to be here with this group of panelists today and learn from them about how to apply data science to agricultural resilience with an eye toward generating more equitable outcomes for the American people. Agricultural resilience touches on so many priorities for the Biden-Harris administration, such as supporting rural communities, being prepared for future climate conditions, using science, data, and technology as engines of progress. It's also relevant to our commitment to equity. President Biden has been clear from day one about how important data is for making sure that government programs and policies yield consistently fair, just, and impartial treatment for all individuals. So I'm looking forward to kicking off the conversation with the panelists after they give their formal presentations, and I'll hand it back to you.
Thanks, Denise. And now I'm turning it over to Parker Anton, who is the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences and a member of the University of Arizona's Presidential Advisory Commission on the Future of Agriculture and Food Production in a Drying Climate. Thank you, Parker.
Thanks, Barney, and welcome everyone. And Denise, it's great to meet you, and welcome back to Tucson. Agricultural resilience. This is something we hear a lot about. We've heard a lot about it for many years. The notion that we need to be more resilient for some imaginary future. But as Duke Paulai, who's one of the speakers today, says, we have here in Arizona, we have the climate of tomorrow today. I stole your line. I'm sorry. I've seen it. You can say it again. We can say it again. And it's really true, and there's nothing like a crisis to focus us. And if you haven't been watching the news or listening or looking at the sky, we've had a bit of a drought here and a crisis. And unfortunately, we tend to be in reactive mode instead of proactive mode for these things. And one of the goals, broad goals we have at the University of Arizona, and certainly with the President's Commission that I'm on, along with Tanner Rock as another member of that commission, I think it's you and I here, I don't see anyone else, is to define ways that the university can be more proactive in helping to assess and solve the issues that face us today in terms of agricultural resilience. The university has been involved for many years in data science related agriculture, going all the way back to the iPlant Collaborative, which was started a $50 million project in 2008, which then became Cyverse, which is, of course, cyber infrastructure for the life sciences and even beyond to all science. And that capacity building of $115 million investment over about almost 15 years now has really, blasted us to a place where we have capacities that few other universities have in terms of the ability to really move forward in data science in general and in agriculture, data science in particular. And today we're going to hear from 6 speakers. I think they're each going to speak for an hour. Is that right? I'm not sure about that, but there'll be time for questions and hopefully discussion. And these talks are going to span a variety of things, ranging from a snapshot of agriculture and economics to leading technologies of agriculture, indigenous data sovereignty needs, workforce developments and data-enabled agriculture, trusted, responsible, data-driven collaboration, and what does the future look like? So I think they're going to be really interesting. Related to the President's Commission, we have a variety of members, and they are diverse in their backgrounds and their expertises. One of the really interesting and insightful things for me has been to have George Friswell visit us and provide an economic resources-based perspective on what goes on in the resource world where they relate to agriculture. It is eye-opening, and coming from inside a university, it really flips the conversation so that you really see what's driving our stakeholders in certain behaviors and how we might use that to move forward in a profitable and a sustainable way. So with that, George is the Bart Carton Chair of Agribusiness and Economics and Policy in the Department of Agricultural Resource Economics, and he's an extension specialist, and you can look at his extensive bio accessing online.
This is Arizona is very unique. There's parts of Arizona agriculture that are like any other place in the world, but Arizona is also a microcosm and is representative of a lot of issues that come up regionally and nationally. So kind of going around the clock, the Colorado River cutbacks are going to confront 7 states as well as Arizona. So water use and water conservation is going to be critical, and data's highlight to that. Yuma is the winter capital of vegetables in the U.S., and the water that isn't completely used up by farmers ends up as return flows for the Colorado River Delta ecosystem. So ag water use has environmental services as well as productive services. We are right on the border, obviously, so produce imports from Mexico are actually a major source of jobs, and relatively high-paying jobs. Up in the Mogollon River and above, we have public lands ranching as the main form of agriculture, although Native American agriculture has actually expanded into vegetable production recently. But fire management is also a critical issue. And all these things require lots and lots of data, geospatial data to understand. This is total weekly lettuce shipments nationally. And the top of that chart is amazing. It's telling you, every time you go to the grocery store, you got to think about it. We have lettuce every time, week in, week out. And it comes basically from 2 places. The hot part of the year comes from the Central Valley, that's the green. During the winter, it comes mostly from Arizona. The little orange is kind of blocked out as the Imperial Valley, which is just the county on the other side of the Colorado River from Arizona. But basically during winter months, you're eating leafy greens, a lot of various vegetables. Likely they came from Arizona. Almost all of it is coming from here in Imperial County. Yuma has increased what's called economic water productivity, the dollar value of what they get per acre foot of water. Once upon a time, we focused on a lot of cotton, a lot of alfalfa. They've moved over time to wheat and vegetable rotations. They've also moved those rotations to cooler seasons, so there's less crop in the ground when it's hot, so there's more money, less water. To the right, there's a thing called location quotients. It's used in regional development, and it measures an area's the industry's share of a specific, let's say, county's overall employment to the national share. And it's a metric of how specialized that area is in that particular sector. And it'll go from bottom to top. So Snohomish County, it's the Seattle suburbs. This is where Boeing is, a lot of related aerospace industries. So aerospace manufacturing jobs. So the number of jobs in that county is 36 times the national average. This is the center of aerospace manufacturing. Wayne County, which is Detroit, motor vehicle manufacturing, location quotient is 16. Santa Clara County, Silicon Valley, electronic computer manufacturing jobs, 35 times the national average. So Yuma, the vegetable and melon production is 67 times the national average. So Yuma agriculture, Yuma vegetable production is what computers are to Silicon Valley, what automobiles are to Detroit. So that's kind of a sense of how big of a deal it is. One more ag slide. Integrated pest management substitutes data and information. A lot of data information, biological data, agronomic data, weather data, entomological data, all kinds of data that substitutes for broad spectrum chemicals. And so this is the use of highly hazardous pesticides in cotton. And it's Arizona. I know it's kind of hard to see it blocked off the other places, but the other ones are up on the top. It's California, Texas, the Mid-South. And it's on a scale of how much they're using. It can be over 100% if you do more than one application a year. In Arizona, it's like 0.5% use of these compounds. And I'll point out, this is on a log scale. I figure every time you're showing your accomplishment on log scale, you're doing a really good job. So we basically eliminated this. Once upon a time, Arizona growers, mid-90s, I think they submitted 8 to 12 applications of these types of things a year. and it's gone down to almost zero. So here's an example where really wise use of all kinds of biological data has great economic benefits and great environmental and health benefits.
Next up is Eric Lyons and Duke Pauli, who are going to tell us about leading technologies for agriculture.
Hi, my name is Duke Pauli at Spark Research with the School of Plant Science. My research program mainly focuses on heat and drought stress tolerance in crop plants. And I'm Eric Lyons. I'm also in the School of Plant Sciences. My research focuses on developing scalable computing systems and computational infrastructure to help plant science research and life science research more generally. So given that my research program focuses on heat and drought stress, Arizona is obviously one of the best places in the world to conduct that type of research. More critically, with shifting weather patterns and the predicted changes in climate scenarios, both nationally and globally, Arizona does have the environment of tomorrow today, but Parker already got that one for me. And he's jinxing my promotion. But that's okay. So really what that boils down to is it gives us this unique opportunity to leverage a natural resource that really nobody else can touch, and that's our environment. We basically live on the verge of what plants could tolerate in terms of performance and production. And so with that in mind, we have this really unique capability to grow and measure and actually see how plants are responding to the stress of the Arizona environment. So the University of Arizona is home to the world's largest agricultural robot. This is called the Field Scanner. It covers about 2 acres of land, about 30 tons. This instrument operates on a continuous basis, scanning the 30,000 individual plants that grow beneath it. This does this 24 hours a day, 7 days a week throughout the growing season. On board, we have a bunch of sensors that are collecting the image data. But what this really provides us as researchers that's unique is the opportunity to actually measure and track these plants over the season. So we can impose conditions like drought stress, but we can also leverage our natural environment in terms of high heat events. The combination of these, we can actually understand the plant's response to stress and try to find those genes that are controlling that. As a community resource, this is very unique because we are providing data at a scale and resolution that's never been available to the agricultural community before. So on board the gantry, we have a series of cameras, but I'll just summarize it briefly. We have an RGB. This is a red, green, blue camera. We also have thermal imaging that can tell us the temperature of the plants, a fluorescence sensor that just tells us how efficient plants are at converting sunlight into biomass. We have 3D scanning capabilities that basically gives us a high resolution rendering of the plant, so we grow these plants in perpetuity so we can hang on this data for a lifetime, as well as hyperspectral data that shows us all the different reflective properties of the plant beyond what the humans can see. What this translates into is a full lot of data. So right now, on an average daily basis, we do 1.5 terabytes of production data. But if we want to go all the way, we can do about 10 terabytes. So if you think about a 120-day growing season, the volume of data we're producing is quite large. And that's what brought us to Eric.
Thank you, Duke. I'll also grab this part here. So when it comes to a project like this, especially one that's generating on the order of a 1/4 petabyte to a 1/2 petabyte per growing season, of which you can grow 2 to 3 seasons per year at full capacity, and the fact that we're at the University of Arizona, which is inherently very interdisciplinary, trying to lower all the barriers to allow collaborative research to happen. And by chance, we have Duke, who is a phenomenal outdoor field agronomist, able to grow and breed plants at scale in extreme environments, and me, who can come in and basically make computers do bidding for researchers. Over the years that I've been at the University of Arizona, I've become involved with a project called Cybers. As Parker mentioned, this project has been funded by the National Science Foundation for 15 years to the tune of $115 million. It started off as iPlant, specifically focused on creating the infrastructure, the computational systems that are required to bring together the nation's plant science communities in order to share, collaborate, and analyze data at scale and as seamlessly as possible. After 5 years, National Science Foundation said, great, you're doing a wonderful job. We're going to go ahead and renew you. But by the way, not just plants this time, all of the life sciences. As that project went on, realized that the underlying technology doesn't care where the data comes from. Could be from plants, could be from animals, could be from any form of science. And so that project was starting to get used by all domains of science in the United States and increasingly across the world, including things such as astronomy, geology, hydrology. So pretty much everything that touches planets, including the opportunity to grow plants on other planets, those data have been passing through Cybers. Over these 15 years, Cybers has helped over 100,000 users. This includes learners, researchers, and instructors. It's been participating or has been referenced in over 1,500 publications and currently is managing over 10 petabytes of data, the majority of which are private research data under active collaboration. Of course, when it comes to this infrastructure, it's also about making it usable and helping people learn how to use it. And the education, outreach, and training programs have touched everything from middle school students to postgrads to senior professors, probably the most difficult demographic to train. And we've touched over 40,000 individuals. Now, this is just taking a look at public Cybers. One of the things that's really important to the National Science Foundation and the U.S. Basic Research Agenda is economic development. And Cybers' general infrastructure, which leverages a variety of open source projects and collaborations in communities, has been redeployed in a variety of different scenarios, including inside of private companies, inside of other institutions across the world. We call that Cybers Professional Services. We have high data security in order to deal with patient data. So we have Cybers Health, as well as claims for defense and other applications through Cybers Defense. In terms of how Cybers works for a project, specifically like one for Dukes, we have this machine, in this case the field scanner, that generates a lot of data. These things basically then take those data, store them on the local cache servers. This is where data are checksum, validated, compressed, and then they're sent over to the Cybers data store. This is the cornerstone of what makes Cybers Cybers. Once they're in this platform, they then have the ability to connect to any type of compute resource. Since this project is based at the University of Arizona, we can use our local HPC system, but this easily could be any of the public compute infrastructures for science. This is through a program now called Access. It could be HPCs at different universities. It could be distributed compute systems such as Open Science Grid. And we can even plug in commercial solutions such as Amazon, Google, and of course Microsoft Azure. Just depending on what people have access to, we lower the barrier in order to make that happen. Through the Cybers Data Store, there is a variety of compute infrastructures in order to make use of those data, including making it very easy to deploy all the common systems and tools for modern data science, including such things as Jupyter, R, scaling through Kubernetes, increasingly Terraform templates. But through this infrastructure, it allows researchers to collaboratively develop new algorithms, scale them up, test them, share them with one another, and importantly, make them publicly available for anyone to use, depending on the needs of the project. And for this particular one, these data must be made publicly available the second they land on Cybers. When that happens, anyone in the world can access them, including the general public anonymously. And similarly, we can design all sorts of fun systems in order to make sure that our processing pipelines are working correctly in order to validate that the system itself is working. Nothing is worse than finding out, and this often happens with outdoor agricultural research, a bird comes along and pecks the sensor of your hyperspectral camera and knocks your $50,000 camera offline. It's good to find that out sooner rather than later. And so this entire processing pipeline has been able to shrink down what it takes to go from raw data to fully processed data from 3 months down to 3 days. So the advantage of working with somebody like Eric, is that we have the ability to merge phenomics data that we're generating along with the data science technology that Eric brings to the table. And specifically in this case, creating a virtual reality environment to which we could explore our data. So, we talked about 300 terabytes per season. No person can sit down and actually make any sense of that when a spreadsheet's about a terabyte in size. So we've come up with this virtual reality environment. This has been a very powerful tool for us for a few reasons. One, it allows people with domain knowledge, the real experts, to put on the goggles and travel from around the world to our field to basically lend their knowledge to, in this case, lettuce. So in this demo, we're walking through the field. We're selecting one of the plants that we're interested in. Once you click on it, it disappears as the high-resolution file loads up. But then you can see we can access all the data associated with just that individual plants. So on the main screen, you can see the plant growing over time in response to the environment.
On the left-hand panel, we can see the different trait data from the other sensors. And specifically, we can see how this plant performed relative to the entire population of plants that we grew. So I know this is kind of like a gee whiz factor, but we'll really think about how humans interact with data, specifically large data. This is becoming a very powerful platform to really explore and question the data. And more importantly, when we think about having the general public get involved in data science, this is the most accessible thing that users can really have access to. We've actually set up a demo in the back of the room, so those people interested, happy to try it out. You can visit the lettuce field in Maricopa. But more importantly, what this is doing for the research component is it allows us to grow plants in silico. What I mean by this is we have the back-end models to basically grow these plants with environmental drivers. Why we're interested in this is because it's a lot cheaper and a lot less time-consuming than actually having to physically grow these plants out. So it basically in this virtual reality environment, we're growing the plants, we're manipulating the environment to see how it responds. This is kind of one of the tools and techniques that we can use to really focus on developing these climate-resilient crop cultivars. And as a final note, this was not planned, our cute outfits, but great lines think alike. That's right. Thank you for your time.
Thanks, Duke. Thanks, Eric. And so what you've seen is that, we have lots of data collectors in the world. We've got incredibly powerful microscopes. We've got the world's largest telescopes. We've got the world's largest gantry. And they're all essentially just data collectors, right? We spend a lot of time focusing on them. But the real issue is taking the data and converting it to information and then to knowledge. That's the secret sauce that has happened here, where we've been able to do that. And it's a competitive advantage for the University of Arizona to have somebody like Cybers that allows that to equally happen. Because across the agricultural landscape, we've seen many large projects stumble at that point. They got the data, everything's great, and trying to link together all those compute analysis resources is prohibitively difficult. This is very complicated. There's a reason NSF gave Cybers 15 years and $115 million to figure it out. It's one of their ignorant geniuses is that they actually gave us more than 3 years to do it because it takes a long time to figure this out. So keep that in mind as we move forward in our next talks. We're going to change pace a little bit now and present Stephanie Carroll from the Collaboratory of Indigenous Data Governance and the Zuckerman College of Public Health to discuss past, present, and future Indigenous data sovereignty needs in agriculture. I'd like to just give you a background very quick. So Stephanie is assistant professor at the Mel and Edith Zuckerman College of Public Health and American Indian Studies graduate program. She's affiliate faculty in the College of Law. She's acting director and assistant research professor in the Udall Center for Studies in Science Policy, associate director of Native Nations Institute in the Udall Center, and finally, a lot of titles, director, Collaboratory for Indigenous Data Governance.
Thank you, everybody. So my part is in the Collaboratory. I have a lot of titles, as you heard. The vast majority of the work that I do is at the intersection of policy and science and how we apply those for Indigenous peoples' futures. And so I'll begin with a little background here of what is Indigenous data sovereignty. And so Indigenous data sovereignty is the rights of Indigenous peoples, as imagined here in the U.S. as tribes or nations, to govern the collection, application, and use of their data wherever it may be. And Indigenous peoples conceptualize data very broadly to be intangible or tangible, and data about our environments, data about us as individuals, and data about us as collectives. So that collective data could be something like language or stories and so forth. And all of these data intersect when we're talking about agriculture. Admittedly, I have zero background in ag, but I do have a background strongly in Indigenous governance. That's not my formal training, but I've worked here at the Native Nations Institute for 23 years and really working with tribes and then nationally and internationally to figure out how do we think through the rights and interests of Indigenous peoples, and in this case, related to data, and work for institutional change within tribes, within universities, repositories, and so forth to enable data futures for Indigenous peoples. And so one of the streams of work that we're doing here, and I'd like to acknowledge my coordinator, Andrew Martinez, and also my postdoc, Lydia Jennings, for their work around this ag work, particularly. And we have looked through two lenses. One is, how do we assess where farmers and Indigenous scholars are in terms of thinking through data, sovereignty, and agriculture? And what are the issues at hand before we start trying to deploy things like digital twins and all of that within Indigenous farming? And then the second thing I'll talk about is working with the carpentries to create a new lesson plan. So this past fall, we convened a workshop online with 20 Indigenous scholars and practitioners. Now, those practitioners are farmers and ranchers. Many of the scholars are actually farmers or ranchers themselves, to ask these questions around what is the role of data and how does that intersect with sovereignty for you as a farmer, and with respect to tribal rights and interests. And so we talked about things around what are the data needs, and how do we integrate that data into larger repositories so we can actually leverage what we're doing in the small farmer instance and think through what that means from a broader perspective. How do we train the next generation? And really, how do Indigenous farms and Indigenous farmers push the boundaries of agricultural success? So the responses we received, and this was facilitated conversation mechanisms that we used, were largely around how do we define and talk about Indigenous data sovereignty in agriculture? So thinking through what is control and protection of data, how do we start talking and moving towards data-informed decision-making? We need data-informed decision-making. And how do we center, at the same time, Native Nation priorities? So how do we have both data for governance, or data for small farmer decision-making, and also at the same time create the governance mechanisms to care for those data in the ways that align with the values of the community. And that leads to this culturally powered decision-making. We also talked about the practical uses of AI and machine learning, and how do we work through all of both the educational needs and the deployment needs of those, and also the stressors of being in farming today where you get new equipment and you must be able to do some of this work. And then finally, what tools are useful for Indigenous data sovereignty in agriculture? And so a lot of need, not surprising to most people, for live examples and training. And so one of the things that has been useful here working with the Data Science Institute is I already had a previous relationship with the Carpentries. I was on their equity council for a while. And then we had Nirav and others here who've had a relationship with the Carpentries before. And so part of our work in the agriculture realm has been to talk with the Carpentries about creating first kind of these workshops that would be for Indigenous students to think about Indigenous data sovereignty, and also about AI in different applications. But once we began meeting with the Carpentries, it became clear that we were interested in, and they were also very, very interested in creating a fourth lesson plan for the Carpentries. And so they're set up where they have trainings around libraries, around data, and around software. So we're moving forward with creating one that has a fake name right now. This is not the true name coming forth, but it's around cultural, ethical, legal, and social implications. And we'll focus on 4 areas to begin. And those are Indigenous data sovereignty trainings around broad and informed consent. One of the issues within Indigenous communities is how do you assess individual and privacy and confidentiality and obtain that, but also obtain collective consent. And increasingly that's required. If anybody's seen the new NSF proposal guideline drafts that come out, one of the things that is in that is that if you are doing work with on native lands or with native species, you're going to have to get tribal approval before you get the grant. And so increasingly important to understand what it means to get collective consent and permissions. And then data as storytelling and artificial intelligence. And so one of the key hitches here is that while there was extreme interest from the Carpentries to create these Indigenous-focused trainings, we are actually using a broader umbrella so that there can be more diversity and equity. and cover topics like diverse epistemologies and AI across communities, not just for Indigenous communities, and the growing issues around diversity within both the epistemologies that are used, but also who's doing data work, and where are they coming from, and how do we train people from diverse backgrounds to be doing that work into the future. So that's it for me. Thank you very much. And I'll just close up by saying, I think our first proposal out of that data, Indigenous data sovereignty and agriculture workshop is actually, Parker was just talking to me, encouraging me to respond to one of his faculty. But yes, we do have proposals coming out of that, and we'll have briefs and papers coming out of that as well. But money is where it is to get things moving. So thanks, Parker.
Thank you, Stephanie. Yeah, we are moving forward very quickly in this area of data science and agriculture and indigenous agricultural practices. We have projects going. What can we learn from the indigenous agricultural practices that have been going on for thousands of years here? We certainly have 23 tribes, 22 tribes in the state. And of course, this is a very important stakeholder. What we need to do is all with a very careful view of the data sovereignty issues. Because they're really important. Next up is we're going to have a brief presentation by Malika Poxnam and Tyson Swetnam on workforce development for data-enabled agriculture.
I'm really grateful to be here, and we're going to be talking about workforce development around agriculture and education, and highlighting some of the things that Cybers has done in the last few years, along with the efforts that are being spearheaded by the Data Science Institute. Okay. So as you've already seen in the preceding presentations, Cybers is there. It's built this next generation cyber infrastructure that can do all the science that needs to be done. The thing that we're lacking is not access to high performance computing or large data sets. What we need are people that can leverage these things, which means that we have to go out there and train the next generation of folks. Just as another example that ties back into the previous presentation, some of the work that we've done has been highlighted by companies like NVIDIA at their annual shareholders meeting. Another Sean Barletta's here. And this work is done by graduate students. So we're training the next generation of data science farmers, but we need to take this technology and get it back out into the field to cooperative extension, to our tribal partners, and show them how to use these cool tools.
You get to some of that. All right, so as Tyson clearly said, the problem is how do we get our users that need to work with this information, work with these tools, how do we get them educated such that they are the agricultural producers of tomorrow and are utilizing data science to really enable everything we've been hearing about today, increased efficiencies, economic growth moving forward. So we partnered with Cybers, the Data Science Institute partnered with Cybers, and we said, hey, we're already working with many of the students. We have a lot of outreach. We have a lot of open sessions that are available. You guys actually have the tools and you have training sets available on this platform. Let's bring them together and start to work on this.
Yeah, and I'll also point out that we are in the year of open science, according to the Office of Science and Technology Policy. And so this is an initiative that started this year, being spearheaded by the NSF, NIH, and NASA. And so wanted to also just lean in with that because Cybers has been teaching open science skills for the last 5 years. We teach a workshop series called Foundational Open Science Skills, or FOSS, which is a play on words because for most of you in the software realm, free and open source software is FOSS. But this lesson was taught in person until the pandemic. It became a virtual workshop series where we focused on teaching early career faculty, graduate students, and even undergraduates in how to do open science. So open science is more than just putting your paper out in an open access journal. It's having open data, it's using open methods, submitting to open peer review, and using things like version controlled software. So this website is publicly available. Anyone can go and take a self-paced lesson and do it themselves, or you can enroll and take it without seeing fall.
All right, and so we actually have a number of different programs that we have developed as part of this, but we have the Roots for Resilience program, which is focused around resilience, both in agriculture, but also environmental resilience, where we take the FOSS programming and then we actually extend it with enhanced learning, where we actually have the students work through their different research projects, have discussions, so that we have this iterative cycle on all of this open foundational science work that is being done, so that they are actually applying it in real time and being able to ask experts for advice, for support, for help, and then we can help them then take that further into their research labs and into the field to continue with agricultural education. Beyond that, we also do a similar program that is focused on health sciences, which relates to agriculture as well. So we have students and researchers who work with agriculture on both sides, both the health sciences side as well as in the Roots for Resilience programs, again, doing that same kind of iterative educational offerings. And all of this is open, as well as all of the workshops, not only that Cypress is getting, but also that the Data Science Institute gives on all of these different tool sets. Because if the students can't actually bring this back out to their employers, if they can't take this out to other researchers, they have to know how to utilize these tool sets and know when to apply them at the appropriate times. And if they can't apply it, if they can't know and feel comfortable in the space such that they can understand the new tools that are coming out. Just today, we were talking about tools that didn't even exist 2 months ago, but yet our students and our researchers need to start being comfortable and familiar with. We have to have programming and training and education that continues to allow everybody, not just those at the university, but those who are out in the field, those who are in research, those who are in the community and the corporate environment in Arizona and nationally, be able to understand how to utilize and share for open science.
Next up is Nirad Merchant, who has about 5 titles and knows everyone in the world as near as I can tell. He is director of the Data Science Institute. He has been a co-PI of Cyverse and is all things data science to the University of Arizona. And he's going to talk to us about trusted and responsible data-driven collaboration.
So I want to talk to you about what it means to have an infrastructure that allows you to trust and work as a team. Because at the end of the day, if you're not working as a team, it is really hard to come up with new insights. So now that we have, now that you heard about all the levels of data, all the levels of analysis and trustworthiness that comes from some of the work that Stephanie mentioned to you about, it's important to have an infrastructure that allows you to extend it to the community and then work with the community, not just in an academic silos. So agriculture has become a convergence of cyber-physical systems. Robots are in your field. They drive themselves into the field and do interesting things. You saw the video and the talk that you heard from Eric and Luke. And this one is from one of our projects called Coalesce, and it just goes up and down and makes measurements and comes back and gives you more insight. But the data is really diverse, and it is growing at a very quick rate. The sensors are getting better. The automation is getting better. And AI and ML is in almost every facet of that decision making. But the reality is that the sharing of data is extremely limited. People are not willing to share that because there are many, many concerns, some very valid, some not so valid. But then we have to make collective decisions. If somebody is making measurements in one field and you are the next field, most likely many of these things apply to you. And there is no good reason why you should be censoring up at that level. And often somebody's objective is to make you buy more sensors, but you don't need them because that same sensor is producing a lot more data. And so making collective decisions and discoveries, if we collaborate and can do that safely and trust that, we can save a lot of energy, we can save many, many things that impact the environment, especially when it comes to computing and data. So the word commons, and some of you may recognize where this is. This is Sabino Canyon, and everybody here, and who is not even here, Denise this morning, had a chance to go visit it, because when you go to the Commons is a place that's cultural, national resource, and is accessible to all members of society. And you can think of natural materials, air, water, the earth. These are resources that are held in common. They are not private. And unfortunately, when it comes to data, and to keep the word data commons over and over recurring in different groups, but when you think of data commons, people think of it as a walled garden, but the commons is meant for you to come there feel good about it, but contribute to it and keep it clean and nice so that you want to go back to it. If you're going to make it dirty and not good to be there, nobody's wanting to use it. The same is true for data. So your data commons is not something where you bring a dump truck of data, drop it and leave, and then you put the label and say, yes, data commons available to everyone. I've done my open science. I want out of here. And so we want to change what that means to have a data commons. And over the years, we have started understanding what a good data commons is. Some of you may have seen N3C, which is the National COVID Consortium. And we all know healthcare data is painfully hard to share for many, many reasons. But about 76 sites now got together. They contributed the data from the EMRs, from their tests, and they created this enclave where the ability to give access to anyone to that data became really easy. NIH has done a great job of making things that are common. Once your institution signs for something, anybody at that institution can go and start using it. And this has allowed much better understanding, a much quicker understanding of disparities and including long COVID and what needs to be done, because the lab results, the medication, the procedures and visits are all available for further analysis. And so the secret for the enclave is that the people that are clinicians, scientists, and informaticians, policy experts, are all working together, and they can examine the things that matter to them and not just a static PDF report that is produced by someone. And then, as Tyson said, most likely could be ChatGPT, and we don't want to trust that blindly, do we? So the enclaves and commons are where people come and work together. And Ag Data Commons is becoming a reality, and it's something that the University of Arizona is really poised to support the community. We are a land-grant institution. We have a really robust community relationship through our trusted network. We have an amazing plant and animal science expertise through our departments. You heard about our global leadership in cyber infrastructure. And then we also now have expertise in building enclaves where people can come in once they have the right credentials, do science as a team. And then you also heard about FAIR and, more importantly, CARE principles, where we are working with the groups to make sure that this is done right. And then we also now have expertise in privacy and federated learning, which allows you to keep your data where it needs to be and work on these systems that eventually just export parts of it, and nobody can reverse engineer and take your data away and do different things. And finally, there's a lot of knowledge and workforce development and training that you heard about. So when you put all of this together, we are an amazing place to grow this even further and create the Ag Data Common. So with that, thank you.
Finally, we have Channa Rock, who's a professor and extension specialist in the Department of Environmental Science. And she's also on our President's Commission, and we have designated our futurist. And so she is thinking forward. She's going to talk to us today about what does the future look like, how extension translates science into action. And I just want to say a little bit about your career and what you do, your specialty. She is a specialist and works extensively with our produce and agricultural producers in the state and on food safety, bacterial contamination, all things like that. When it hits the fan and you hear about some contamination in Yuma or coming supposedly out of Yuma or somewhere else, it's Channa who is our lead person, and that's not her fault. She's out there finding out what happened, why, and also leading our efforts in terms of public communication.
Awesome. Thank you. Great. Well, I appreciate the opportunity. So it's pretty rare to find me dressed in heels. I'm usually in boots and there's mud and, hair up in a ponytail. But I'm with Cooperative Extension. I'm not physically located on campus. I'm about 90 miles north of campus. I'm at the Agriculture Experiment Station, Big Back, or the Maricopa Ag Center. Duke, we see him, from time to time. He visits us up there. But it's really nice to be up there because we're embedded within the communities in which we work, right? So you heard a little bit about Cooperative Extension just prior to this, right? We have 15 counties. We have extension offices with faculty and staff in each of those counties. We have 8 tribal entities and tribal extension offices embedded as well across the state.
And then in addition to that, we also have these research centers. So I work on a 2,000-acre farm so that we can mimic some of these amazing tools and technologies, and we can bring in, it could be our classroom, right? We can bring in society, we can bring in growers to be able to demonstrate these technologies in a hands-on manner. And I'll show you some of that today. But one of the things that I wanted to do to shift a little bit is we have a video. So if you guys want to bring that up, you've heard from all the pointy-headed scientists about what we think the future looks like and about all of the technology and all the great things that we do. But I thought it would be good to ask a grower.
When I think about the future of farming, I think about it a couple different ways. I think about the past and in the last 100+ years that we've been farming productive crops in the desert and how we got here and how our relationship with the University of Arizona has gotten us there. And I think about the future and feeding the world and the nation for the next 100 years. And we need agriculture. Failure is not an option. We're going to need science and technology and data to get us there in the future.
Awesome. So that is Amanda Brooks. She's with Harrison Farms. Unfortunately, they were one of the key players in the 2018 romaine outbreak. They are the most committed to science and translation of science. So it just goes to show that no matter how much technology and information and how committed you are, things still happen, right? And we still need additional resources to be able to figure out some of these problems. So we put together kind of this vision, and this is just a bunch of keywords, right, that you've probably heard throughout the day, right? With this new era of smarter agriculture, we're really thinking about capacity building for rural access to technology, right? So a lot of the places in which I work don't have Wi-Fi, right? We don't have 5G capabilities. How the heck are we going to deploy some of these technologies that rely on these data systems? So that's a huge barrier that we're trying to overcome. And how are we going to do that? We want to be able to have these growers and other folks be able to use these data platforms. Obviously, predictive analytics was brought up today, and I'll touch on that a little bit. But you should see growers' faces when we say all these things, right? Their eyes get really big. And they go, oh my God, how the heck are you going to teach my, 75-year-old father to be able to implement these? Well, we can do it. There's just different mechanisms to do that for different types of folks, right? We want to address new business models. George talked a little bit about how important Arizona is specifically for feeding the nation. It's a food security issue. It's a food safety issue. It's a health issue. If production in Arizona goes down, what does health look like for the rest of the country for the accessibility to fresh fruits and vegetables during different times of the year? And I can't impress upon you how important that is, and for us to be thinking about that. And again, we want to foster this development of this stronger culture in tech-enabled, right? So again, how do we put tech in the hands of the folks that are going to be using it? Again, just want to remind everyone, right? Information is not knowledge. We really see ourselves in cooperative extension as being the folks that put that information into action. I can have the shiniest tool in my toolbox, but if nobody's going to ever use it, then who cares, right? So everything that we do in cooperative extension is boots on the ground. It's applied. And this is what it looks like, right? We're taking technologies out into the field and we're demonstrating these side by side, shoulder to shoulder with the folks that we want to implement these technologies. And so these are some of my staff. Obviously, we do a lot of work with lettuce and lettuce production in the state, also in California as well. I want to remind everyone that cooperative extension is a boundary organization, right? We're positioned between science, its application, and society. And we're really viewed as that trusted partner within society, right? So we help identify problems with the growers next to us, right? We go to meetings where we say, hey, what are the issues that you're facing? How can I help design and develop new technology or new data transfer platforms to help solve that problem with you? I'm not in my high tower at the university coming to them saying, I have a solution for you. I'm never going to do that, because if I do that, they're not going to trust us to be able to implement that technology. We develop those solutions, we assess them and how they're working, and we assess them with growers. So what's really great is that we have the research arms that we can be able to deploy. But 9 times out of 10, if you're talking to a specialist, we also have work that's going on side by side with growers themselves. So we might assess technology, and then we might say, hey, will you partner with us? Let us go ahead and deploy this to see how that works. We're going to assess that, we're going to develop, we're going to adjust, and we're going to be able to start this cycle all over again. I like to put this one up on the right-hand side. I stole this from our IPM specialist. How extension is problem-solving, issue-driven research, fully integrated with engaged outreach, right? They're not separate. They're not, in those separate silos. They're fully integrated. And really, our goals are to look at changing behaviors and conditions. That shows what success looks like for us. So, what does the future look like? That was supposed to be my talk, right? About what is the future, right? We can all close our eyes and think about 1,000 different things. And here's the top 4 things that when I went out to poll industry a couple weeks ago, as we were putting together this presentation, these are some of the things that they brought up. So you already heard about new technologies that are being placed on tractors and implements and in everything in the field. So this swarm farm technology kind of idea where we're starting to put increased sensors out. They're starting to communicate with each other, and we see this implemented already. The thing that's not great about how it's being implemented already is how we're utilizing and capitalizing on that data that's being collected. We talk to growers that have massive amounts of data and they don't know what to do with it, right? And so how do we develop platforms? How do we develop training opportunities? How do we do workshops over time so that they are fully integrated with their day-to-day operations? The next thing is this idea about connected or smart farms. So I'll give you an example. So I have Farm A over here. They've been collecting water samples, every other week for, this season. They start to see salmonella start to pop up. And this is a real scenario. They might contact me and I might be the person in the middle that says, oh, okay, we know that there's a salmonella issue coming over here. Farm B, who's, 6 miles away, they also start to see something pop up. They might contact me. Farm C, also the same thing. I know that there's an issue bigger, broader, that's going on because I'm in the middle and getting that information from these folks because we're a trusted colleague. But they don't necessarily know the power of that data and that data sharing to be able to make informed decisions and predict decisions. So starting to think about how we can connect data from farms across a broader space and time, really to fall into this bottom right hand, right? Predictive analytics. What are those triggers? What are those measures? What does that data look like so that we can make decisions faster to circumvent an outbreak, to make a decision or shift and change in our water usage or our nutrient availability? So there's all sorts of things that growers are starting to think about related to predictive analytics. And there on the bottom left-hand side, I have something that has already been touched on, right? Is this agriculture and tech savvy workforce. What I think we've done and we have is a really tech-savvy workforce. They know the tools. They don't necessarily know agriculture very well, right? You've got a guy who loves to sit behind a computer and program all day, and he absolutely understands his model. But you throw him out in the field, and his eyes are open, and he's got no idea what to do and how to consume that information. So how do you take those two things, marry them up to create a workforce that's going to be comfortable in analyzing information and relaying that information, but can also go to a grower meeting, right? And then at the back of a pickup truck and have a conversation with the person that's supposed to be implementing that technology. How are you going to do that, right? So a lot of things that we're thinking about in that space, right? So data-enabled technology, we're growing the future of sustainable agriculture, and hopefully you could see, right, University of Arizona is ahead of the field. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Jen. Yeah, come on up here. And while they're doing that, I just want to say that food safety and this issue is a really challenging one because, you could have 6 people who get sick in Toronto out of 2 billion servings of food, and we freak out, right? The issue of scale and what we're willing to risk is zero for food safety.
So thank you all. These were such fabulous presentations. And I'm coming at this, so I love seeing what you are doing, and I'm curious who you're not reaching. So I'll start with I'll tee up a question. I think I'll start with you, Channa. And then if we could just start a dialogue to keep it sort of more conversational, that would be great, because clearly there's so many points of intersection across your work. So as you introduce innovations in agriculture around data, how do you make sure that we're not further exacerbating disparities? The broadband access is an obvious one. And we know that disparities, especially when faced with shocks and stressors like drought or climate change, that they tend to exacerbate. So how do we make sure that we're buffering against enhancing the disparities that already exist?
So I definitely top really loud for me first. So right, as you saw, we do have folks spread across the state, right, within cooperative extension, within tribal extension. I think one of the things that we're really keyed into now is focusing in on who are those target audiences for a lot of the messaging and making sure we're messaging them appropriately and designing workshops or platforms that are appropriate. So almost all, if not all, of the content that we develop now is translated into Spanish, right? So we know that a large predominant population of the workforce that is going to be implementing some of these technologies, specifically in the ag sector, is Hispanic. And so how do we tailor that? I think the other thing is understanding that workforce dynamic and meeting them where they are, right? So we do not do trainings in the middle of the day. Right? We do trainings in the evening, at nights, after hours. We do trainings on the weekend. We pay people to be able to come to our trainings, to be able to try to make that a little bit more accessible. But I do think we're, again, try to really key in on who those target audiences, and that's just a couple examples. Anyone else have?
I'll just say that we're open source. So all of our training are online. So the minimal accessibility point is an internet connection. And you already mentioned broadband. So we have to make sure that these places where people live have access to the internet. If they can connect to the internet, they can connect to cybers, and they can do the best data science in the world.
So some of the things that we're also focusing on is trying to make this technology affordable and at a scale where you don't have to be a massive operation where you need a data science team and you need engineers and operators. So what is the technology readiness level? And can we make it really quick to be matured? And then when it's commercialized, it is something that is very affordable from the onset. And so even though they may not sound something that reaches a very broad community, so the smaller groups that want to get into this business can use that technology much sooner, and they don't really have to rely on a massive corporation for it.
I'll just add one more piece to this, which is the importance of role models. And it's the importance of role models in terms of the teaching, training, and education component. Nirav and I teach a course called Applied Concepts in Cyber Infrastructure. It was through that course, which is a blend of undergraduates, usually at the junior, senior level, and some graduate students that we bring together to solve large, complex, computational, scalable problems, leveraging researchers on campus as the course client. When it came to the example that Duke and I talked about, that started as a project by a bunch of undergraduates with a couple of graduate students. And core to that was making sure that the teams themselves were incredibly diverse, because when it comes to developing these kinds of complex solutions, it's not just about being technically capable. It's about delivering a solution that anyone can use. And so that basically reaches from how do we make this approachable? How do we have necessary documentation? And how do we present it to people moving forward? We love the class because it really mimics the real world. The students hate the class because it mimics the real world. One of my favorite things that students ask is, what's the rubric? How do I know I'm doing well? What does it take to get an A? And Nirav and I look at them and say, easy. Is the client happy? Just like in the real world. They're like, what does that mean? I'm like, imagine you go out there and you're charged with delivering a task and you don't do it. Do you think the client is going to sit there and be like, good try, C-? No, they're going to want their money back. But one of the core things that we discovered while teaching this course over many years, and this is a big, big problem for us at the beginning, was just by nature of it being advanced computational technologies, we tended to be very biased towards a male student audience. Approximately 80% of the students were male. And throughout the course, we noticed that we had a drop rate. Maybe we'd have about 30, 35 students enroll, 4 or 5 of them would drop out. The vast majority were women or female. And this alerted us to a severe problem that was happening. And we actively started to search across campus for trying to understand what the problem was. and ultimately, at the end of the day, came down to role models. We're both males. A lot of the clients that we were bringing in were males. And so once we were notified that we needed to get diversity on the leadership of these projects, and specifically bring in teams of researchers that were being led by female scientists, our drop rate changed dramatically. We went from 80% drops of women in the class to 100% retention. It was just amazing to see that. What that spoke to, especially for us, and as we think about taking these technologies out there, is how do we make sure we're training the right people to be out there in the communities, showing diverse people that they can do the same thing. And that's just one of the things that we find to be really important.
Thanks. So I'm just going to hop off what everybody else has said here about making all the work be relevant to the communities that we're working with. And say from an Indigenous perspective, there's a lot to be said for language. So not just translating into language, but understanding how language is the nexus of relationships and what that means within agriculture. And so I'll give a couple examples of that. So one might be in many communities, seeds are our relations. We have responsibilities to them. And those responsibilities have roles for different peoples within the communities. A lot of that has been broken and disrupted by ongoing colonialism, but movements to increase agriculture within communities on their own terms has been really important in reinstating those relationships. And they have important considerations too when we think about climate and resilience and the knowledge that Indigenous peoples hold within their languages and within those relationships for contribution to larger society. And so as you increase trust and accountability by doing more work that is community engaged and actually responds to the needs on the ground, you increase that trust and accountability and also that sharing of knowledge that is vital for all of us into the future.
So an extension, it's important to listen. It's important for information to be a two-way flow. And if you ask people, does this make sense? Is this what you're looking for? You're less likely to exclude them than if you just plow in and say, here, I'm going to talk at you. Because I learn a lot because it's a lot of situations you go in, oh, the problem they're facing is not at all what I thought the problem is. And so the people educate folks at the university level students, there's a lot of times you have to take a step back. You think, oh, everybody knows this, right? And you're like, oh, well, a third of the students don't know this. Okay, well, we have to get everybody up to speed because once they're lost and can't go further. And so you have to make sure that it's something that they can grasp and succeed at instead of it just going over their head. Once upon a time, I was at CEA, and so I teach a policy class, and I tell my students, oh, well, what kind of answer? You want the noon answer? I got to pick up the kids at soccer at 3 answer? You want the next week answer? And they laugh. I go, what's different? Because depending on the immediacy of the situation, you have a time constraint, you have data constraints. So a lot of times, we've been talking about more data. And there's a lot of cases where you can get away with pretty good answers, with very little data. And that's as important. And you tell students, like, oh, we've done things where, oh, someone just took yield, with a calculator, they got an answer. Somebody else had a multi-country computable general equilibrium model of the whole world economy. And it's like, oh, the answers are within 15% of each other. So sometimes simple is great. And letting students know that, too, is important.
I love that concept of simple. And I'm also wondering, so as a university, you have a lot of touch points with farmers in this state, for example. But for every farmer that you're able to interact with, or every student you're able to interact with, there's a larger number that you're not. Are you using any indicators to identify, for example, if you know the conditions of one farm, that there might be another farm that has similar conditions that could apply some relevant science? So sort of a more active outreach to those communities that might be left behind otherwise?
So I would say we definitely are, right? So what we're trying to do first is convince growers that there's certain data that they need to start collecting over time, right? And so I think we've done a good job of that. I think the next step, right, is to say, what are the similarities and what are the differences between the types of data that you're collecting, and how do those set the baseline levels or triggers for decisions that are made in similar, regions, right? So we look at a lot of our data regionally, right? Like regional production. So you heard about Yuma, you heard about Imperial. There's a lot of production that happens in Mexico as well. And so we can use that initial data collection by a few to make inferences about what rainfall might impact, growing in a different region with a similar climate. So that's just kind of one example. But I think what we're also starting to do is take an even bigger step back to look at this kind of on a much bigger basis, right? So not just Arizona. How does that translate to other growing regions of the world? And what's the type of data and information that's publicly available that we can garner to be able to make decisions and relay that information?
So in Arizona, we care a lot about our water. And there is some great work done by some of our cooperative extension folks on both tracking drought at a regional scale using remote sensing. And so there are portals where you can go and you can see visibly what the departure are from long-term trends. So are we in a drought, or is it greener than usual? And then applying that technology both towards probably water and irrigation, planning, and then also actually running it out into the field during the season. So yeah, there are platforms out there that are available to our people.
And I like how that applies to the concept of being a boundary organization to help with that engagement and conversation. I wanted to turn to some, if we could give some concrete examples of how we might deliver value back to those who provide the data in the first place. And I thought I might start with Tyson and Malika, if you have any concrete examples I might speak to.
Okay. Yeah, so people are providing their data to us, and then we need to provide value back to them. So some of the tools that we're trying to push on center around the FAIR data principles, and Stephanie didn't talk about the CARE data principles specifically today, but ensuring that data are protected and then shared freely is very important. The resources that we're teaching people to use involve reproducibility. So if we can build a Jupyter notebook in Python that does an analysis on one farm, that analysis can be then ported to another farm and it can be reused. And so we're trying to teach our students how to build research objects that can be shared and reshared. So the data sets are protected or shared, the analytical code is open, and then that can be repeated in other places. That's my shortest answer. Yeah.
One of the things that we're working on, in addition to this project that I presented here today, is working with repositories. So Cyberse, but also Neon, and other large repositories across the country to be able to find Indigenous data, because one of the issues is that there's a lot of Indigenous data within these repositories that Indigenous peoples can't access and then use. And so be able to find that, whether through algorithms or geographic location or what have you, and then be able to create relationships with those data within those systems. And so some of that is through metadata. So we have an effort with the IEEE to create a recommended practice on the provenance of Indigenous people's data, so to include provenance information, but also there's a project called Local Context, and they have digital tags for traditional knowledge and biocultural resources that you can include with your data that the communities can place in there that connects them and helps to maintain that relationship through the data lifecycle. And so the relationship can be as simple as around attribution, but also provisioning when those data can be used and who could use them and for what purpose, and then also establishing that relationship for benefit for those Indigenous peoples.
Great. I'll give one more example. So one of the things that we're working on in the food safety realm is, again, all this information is collected about pre-harvest testing or water testing, specifically looking for pathogens right out in the environment. And this is all individual grower held data. And there's such power in looking at that data as a whole, right? I gave that example. And so one of the conversations that we're having now is with the regulatory community. So can we anonymize the data and collate that information? And can we share that with the regulatory community, being the FDA, for example? And by having that partnership with that regulatory community, maybe the university being that intermediary that helps it to hold some of that information, will that in the future reduce regulatory pressure on those specific growers, right? So instead of having FDA swoop in to do analysis or to, do an outbreak investigation or something like that, because they're already having that trust and that data sharing, although anonymized, does that reduce that pressure? And that's something that industry would love to have, right? They're in control of their own destiny in a sense, right? It's their own data. They have trusted it, and they're being able to share that in a safe space. Yep.
So kind of skirted around OpenAI and ChatGPT. But one thing I've done is just recently is that I can use these tools to ask how to write code or how to do a specific task. And I can find that it actually draws from our public documentation that we've already written. So good documentation on your project means that someone in the ether can find your work, and a robot will tell them how to repeat it. So good documentation, good metadata.
So that was almost where I was going to go, Tyson. So it's easy to talk about the technology and the technical aspects and the cyber infrastructure and the programming that goes along with this. But I think a lot of the education programs that we run build in social interaction and talk about the foundations of simple elements such as communication. How do you communicate your science? How do you communicate it to somebody who's not in your discipline so that when you're talking, you can explain your research or science, the implications, and as well as Tyson just mentioned, the documentation so that it's there so that the next person coming along can actually go back, understand, have trust in what you developed, and then start learning how to bring that into their own research, their own conversations, and working across.
I guess from the pure research side aspect, I feel like, our allocation of running grant-funded research programs, I think the thing that we give back besides the known as volume data are the tools that we're developing. So this pipeline that Eric helped us develop, we've sunk probably over $1 million in it. And it's free, it's out there, anybody can use it, including private industry. So I think it's another way we're extracting a lot of value and giving back to the community that does support us ultimately.
So I can give you a very nice concrete example of when you want to count the kernels on the cob, everybody develops their own method, but there is one person that can do it really well. And the corn growing in Wisconsin and corn growing, let's say in Arizona, they're shaped a little bit differently, and that method doesn't really translate right over. And if you make it easy for that person to tune it and then give it to the next person and they can use it, it becomes easy. And so I like to tell people that in Cyberse, we are not in the business of scaling computation. We're in the business of scaling people, because that one person can now help 3 or 4 groups, because now it's really easy for them to share their data. But at the end of the day, because they've now tuned it on 5 different kernels, they are now able to generalize that method. So as these advanced method comes along, they're not always generalized. Industry may want to say that there is, general purpose AI, that's far away. But all of these methods need some localized, some tuning, some data that comes from there. And once it's tuned, it can perform really well. And so that's how we get back.
And I wanted to follow up, Stephanie, with a question that was a question I have from your comments. Is there a complete feedback loop? I love the idea of the metadata and knowing the provenance of the data. And so as a provider of data, would you then know what insights came from it? Would that come back to you, or is that a reality yet?
In terms of being a tribe who provides data? Yeah, so one of the things that you see within those traditional knowledge labels are the ability to put in a tag that says, who do you contact if you want to use this data? But that following through is one of the things that we talk about all the time. And so I think one of the good example of this is the main eDNA portal. They have a process where if data comes in, so if anybody deposits that data and it's they use geographic identifiers, or if it's declared as belonging to a certain tribe, they automatically contact the tribal historic preservation officer there. And so there is that responsible loop within their system, which is one of the prime examples that we use for how do you do this and how do you put it into practice and make sure that it's somebody's responsibility.
Excellent.
Just to follow up a little bit on that, one of the key things when it comes to a lot of the tools that are being designed, it's about baking in provenance and reproducibility from the ground up. And we all have run into the problem where, especially on the academic side, is you see a publication, there's some neat results, they have their code. If you're really lucky, it's up on GitHub, or there's a container, a Docker container that you can use to quickly reuse it. When you get a hold of it, you can't regenerate the results exactly as they have it. And that degree of difficulty, really can get deep down to what is often called, Nerva's great person to reference this, the first author syndrome, which is only the first author of the publication can actually get that thing to work in the way that was used to generate results in the data. And so when it comes to that reproducibility, one of the core things when it comes to a lot of the shared cyber infrastructure projects, Cyverse is a good example of this. Early on, I developed the genomics platform for comparing genomes against one another. But baked into those is the idea that when an analysis is run, everything that went into running that analysis is cached as metadata and automatically attributed to the results that are generated. And what that means is the automatic linking so that anyone in the future can reproduce it. Because as much as we love metadata, as much as we can encourage people with tools at that onset when they're collecting it and depositing it to have it in there, it's great. It's that next person that picks it up and goes and does something where, they say, I'll take care of it. Sure, no problem. I check the box, I download it, or I send it over to another system. I do some analyses on it. And they have no incentive to really make sure that the metadata is tracked, and importantly, the provenance behind it. So many of those automation into the tools behind the system. So I just wanted to make sure that got said as well.
Yeah, thank you. So I have one final question, and that is, with so much new data flowing, how can we increase access to science and data so they are useful for local policymakers and also for public engagement? Chana, I loved your example about maybe potentially easing the regulatory burden by proactively sharing the data with regulators. Are there other concrete examples of how we might turn these data into action that deliver better outcomes at scale?
Well, again, with the pesticide regulation, a lot of times, but the entomology department is just like stunningly good here. I'm always impressed. But there are cases where they'd go into PA where it's like, we know you have this environmental goal. You can achieve this environmental goal in a way that does not cost growers as much money. And like, oh, great, and EPA actually wants to have that science behind their regulatory decisions as opposed to trying to fly blind from Washington, D.C. So building in flexibility in the system is important. A lot of agricultural stakeholders I deal with, what they want in terms of the economics, they're very good at growing the crops, producing the livestock, them doing. What they want to convey is the role of agriculture in their communities. So they want to talk to the county supervisors, they want to talk to the state legislators, and they want their story told. And so part of it is, how do you provide data in a way that's useful for them to explain? And there's a lot of cases where it's like, I give presentations, and early on I have these slides that were very, very busy, and they would pull me aside. It's like, you need to break that up into like 17 sides. Well, if you have to break it up into 17 slides, you're in trouble. But so you learn about, okay, what information do they need? What's the format to get to policy people? And that's a thing that's really, really tricky of, but again, listening, and also listening to what they want, listening to their criticism of what you're giving them is really crucial.
So George, like briefly mentioned wildfires in Arizona, which is actually my research background. So this is a wildfire example. So you can use drones to fly over urban interface areas and map every tree at a very high resolution. And so we're doing that. We have an award
here in the state of Arizona to work on fire hazard defense and urban interface. That data can go straight up into a public cloud like Cybers. We just leave it there, and the insurance companies and the banks that are issuing loans can go and look at that data and make assessments on the risk factors to those homes. And so these are all public data sets that are available. Policymakers can then go in and make decisions about whether or not fuels treatments need to take place in certain spaces. But we're doing this in an open way. Our code is available, the techniques are available, and it's a little scary. People may not want their information out there, but it's already out there. The public information about your home and its location, and then the risk that you're under. So that's one example that is already being implemented. So I think we're at the juncture where we can have a conversation with our data. We have not been able to do that, and now we are sort of at the cusp where you can ask questions that are your questions rather than the projection of what that dashboard was built. Because even our dashboard can be completely biased because it's showing you certain dimensions. And where I'm going with this is that everything that we work with is high dimensional data. It's highly connected. And the person that normalizes that data for you is increasing their own bias during that process. And so you have to allow people to be able to reproject that to the question that they have with minimal effort. And the example that you saw from Duke and the work that Devin's done, where that lettuce in the field, there are so many dimensions to it, but it is put in a way that a researcher who's wanting to it can walk up to it and then look at it and get all the information they need to make their decision. And so I'm a fan of the equivalent of what's called a knowledge map, where you can now extract these things and put them in sort of the information visualization realm that is meaningful for the person, but the next person coming in can put their own data lens on it and then ask a question that matters to them. And the technology is lining up as long as we align the data and allow it to be positioned for doing this. And you heard from the example where Tyson said that the systems are going to go ingest that documentation, and then you can ask the documentation questions about what you want to do. So that data conversation is what's going to become a reality in the very near future for us, and that will be helpful.
Well, thank you all for answering my questions. And anything, I'm coming away with this, which is the renewed sense of how it is absolutely true that data science is a team sport. And just to see all of you talking and bringing your superpowers to the work and passing this on to the next generation and to folks in agriculture and elsewhere. So thank you so much for the fantastic work that you're doing. And I think we'll pass it on to questions from the group now.
Thank you very much. We're open for questions. Anybody else have questions for our assurance for the questions here? Oh, Parker's got one for us.
Sure. Nirav just touched on a point that I think is future's coming rapidly to us in terms of the ability of AI to really lower the barriers in a positive way. I mean, you can think about it negatively, but positively. So all you have to do is query, and in the background, abstractions are happening, code's being written, answers come back. What do you all think of that, and how far out in the future do you think we are?
Okay, so it happened yesterday on Twitter. I saw it. But it's happening now, and it's a good point, though, about the lowering of barriers that you don't have to learn how to code, I don't think, anymore.
I said I think it was the reason
Yeah. So I think it redoubles the importance of education and special domain, because you have the experience to then, call BS on the AI, and that's something it can't do. It can't reason, but it can present to you the totality of human knowledge that it has. So prediction is always hard, but this is my version of it. The last mile is always the challenge. It has always been the challenge, and anything that you're seeing right now, the Gartner hype cycle of peak of values that you're thinking that is unrealistic expectations. So this is going to eventually come down to a plateau of productivity. And the way it's going to come down is the last mile is not going to be achievable. All the little things that we want to do, the fun things are going to be done, but the actual things that are required for concrete decision making will require some tuning and tweaking to put it together. And that is going to come from a different technology that is also growing alongside, which is called low code and no code environments. And the AI is going to infuse itself into low code and no code environments where then you can take your Lego blocks and it knows how to connect them, but you're controlling the sequence of ways that this AI is helping you walk through that question, and you're controlling that, and then you're going to get an answer which is more towards the last mile, and then that becomes a device or an object which now is what you're working with.
I'd love to take this mostly just to disagree with Meryl. And the disagreement's minor, but I think it's important. I think we're on the plateau now. We've already passed through the peak of inflated expectations. We've seen the trough, and now we've seen the rubber hit the road towards generative AI. And we've been seeing the impact in terms of AI, especially around identification and classification, for decades now. You, in fact, are the one who pointed out to me when I said, how come Google isn't charging me for my photo storage? And you said, they got all the data they need out of you, Eric. They're not going to charge you for the service. You've helped train their algorithms to identify every single feature, mood, setting, idea, and overall environment of every single photo you can upload. And if you ever had a chance to play with one of these things, it's absolutely amazing. You put it in there and you get sentiment on your photo. Happy game. Fun environment, or something sad, plus all the other objects, identifiers, and interestingly, the individuals who you've already tagged that are inside of there. And it's great. But there's sort of like these two interesting, I guess, challenges where we are right now in terms of what AI means. And the first, I think, goes back to one of the questions you asked early on, which is, what does this mean in terms of the digital divide? Is this getting bigger? And does it make it smaller? And the answer is, I think, still out. AI has a lot of opportunity to help shrink the gap, but access to the AI has a lot of opportunity to expand that gap, especially in terms of how you use it and how people are using it. Just as an example of that front, on that front, my wife is here in our business school in business communication. And can you imagine what's happened in the last 2 months since ChatGPT came along for business communication? What percent of papers do you think she gets turned in have been run through one of these ChatGPTs to clean it up? 100%, very close to 100%. And she's just interested in not only just in terms of what students are doing, but how they're using it. It's pretty obvious in terms of some papers that were just like, hey, write something about this, because it misses sort of the major components that a business communication professor would want to see in terms of bottom line on top and layout of discussion, conclusion statements. But what she's also noticing is just like how many of them have been run through it, because there's software now from grading systems that will give them a score. And so she's engaged her students to basically ask, so I keep walking away from being underneath these speakers. She's asked her students not so much like, hey, I'm mad at you. It's more like, how are you using this? How is this changing your workflow? And how do I incorporate this in terms of what we're teaching for BCom? Because it's going to be happening across everything that's out there. So for her, it's just neat to see that students not only are, write out their thing and say, hey, make this sound more professional, makes it sound more professional. And then students will take it and run it through another algorithm that says make it sound dumber in order to help pass through the algorithm checking depending on which professors are out there. But it's fascinating to see what's happening on that front. But in terms of teaching and education, making sure that these tools are in the hands of everyone and not just those that can afford the $20 a month subscription to ChatGPT or the $15 for, 100 Dolly images. It's really important to consider about how we close those gaps so it's not increasing the divides.
Anybody else? Okay, so I'm going to bring it back to ag. So is this disruption as big as Haber-Bosch? For ag? Is this what we're on? Are we transforming from chemistry is what drives ag to data and information is the driver of ag? Are we there? Or we look back at this 20 years from now and say, is that big or not? Did I just completely go off? What? So what is the production now?
Handfuls of fertilizer was a data they were going to get it. We're not going to double our production. I'll look at two. I don't think we can double our production per acre again with AI.
No, but I think certainly we can improve the efficiency that we're extracting from our land since we are out in the arable land. So I think this is this the defining moment? Maybe not. But I think it also ties to what Chana says, though, is all this technology is great, but if it's not getting the people that can actually use it, it's pretty worthless. And, if we want that transformative moment, it's the work that Chana's doing and, actually educating people, sitting in the ivory tower, VR demo's not going to do anything. So I think we're at that transformative moment, but I guess I would say, to really execute, it comes up to education and getting this technology to people that need it.
No pressure, right? Oh my gosh. No, I would agree, right? So we struggle, right, with that last mile a lot of times, right? I think we're good at communicating to industry the power of the data that they're collecting, but actually putting it into practice that will eventually change a behavior that will result in a benefit, I think is very tangible for some and very far away from being tangible for others, right? So, but I think, right, as you see increased pressures, right, as Duke mentioned on natural resources, water being one of them, you're going to be forced into these channels that you're going to have to utilize this type of information and analysis of your own data to make decisions. And I think that is probably, right, it takes a crisis to push people into certain paths, and we're probably nearing that space.
I'm just going to put a plug here for what we put into those data too. And so, we know that Indigenous peoples manage the most biodiverse lands across the world. And we have not yet cracked the nut of how to include Indigenous knowledges within our data systems and what protections we need there. And I don't think we'll get to that point of being able to actually benefit from the data through AI and all of those elements without having those components of data in the algorithms and in the input part. And then for the output part is how do we move machines and AI into Indigenous communities and on Indigenous lands. There's a blog written by Jason Edward Lewis called Baking Cake with Machines. I urge you all to read it. It talks about relationships and how do we conceptualize machines as part of the relations that we live with every day that we are both dependent on and interdependent with. And so I don't know if all of you have been seeing me on my phone, but I have a type 1 diabetes kiddo. We are dependent on wearable tech and basically monitoring at all times. And so it is that how do we come into relationship, how do we benefit from, and how do we think about protecting ourselves in those realms.
As automation will change what it is, our workforce has to have a chance to be part of that change and be prepared for it. And it is our duty to make sure that there is new categories of jobs, just like as you heard with ChatGPT and prompt engineering. Now, prompt engineering is a highly paying job category. And I'll end by saying that in Japan, robots have been allowed to form unions more than 20 years ago. So even automation, and now if it's AI plus automation, it will be a very interesting union to deal with. One question for Steph. So yeah, free about so with so indigenous communities have been exploited for a long time, and how do we make sure that the data that they provide are reciprocal back to them rather than exploited? And so they have the diversity, they have personal information about themselves, but how do they share that without it turning against them, which has been done?
This is where it comes back to the personal part, the people part of it. How do you have those relationships and build those relationships that are based on individuals, but then institutionalized? And so it is thinking through the realm of making those, so I'll put here, you make relationships with tribes within the state. And understand the issues that have been there, and then developed the expectations and the guardrails around the relationship, right? And then we see those in the standard things that we use all the time, data sharing agreements, and increasingly not fully always thinking about use, but access, how to ensure access to those data, and move that up the scale. So you're having it, I talk about it as scaffolding, so throughout the range of institutions that you're dealing with, and then thinking about what that means. And so I'll talk about COVID, for instance, we saw wide scale, everything from agriculture to water to just the basic COVID data was very difficult to access and use for Indigenous peoples. And there were so many barriers put there for getting those data. You know, I've worked with some communities who were looking for water data, and they were held in an NSF repository. They were their data, they're about their wells, right? So how do they access those data so that they can better deal with the crisis at hand? And so it is rectifying a lot of those situations and putting into place those agreements. And, you know, for instance, like the Arizona Department of Health Services is really interested in moving forward with how do you have these equitable relationships that really respect sovereignty.
As we close up, Denise, thank you so much for the questions, for your presentation. Those are fantastic questions from me. Arthur, we'll keep you on as MC every time to get you around it. Fantastic job. To the speakers, I'd already seen these talks once before. Awesome job. You guys did a fantastic job of presenting the Great. Thank you very, very much for that. Initiative, thanks for your partnership and help on this. College of Agriculture and Life Sciences and AIR, thank you as well. So, as we close out, one more round of applause for the speakers.